I want to look at the poem by Ezra Pound, this time Hugh Selwyn Mauberley. A lot of people don't really like this poem or don't really even understand it, and it's understandable, it's clear what the problem is. This is a heavily allusive poem, and it's a kind of classic of modernism, but the kind of modernism that gave birth to Eliot's Wasteland. This is a precursor in many ways of the Wasteland in terms of the fragmentary, allusive technique, and it certainly illustrates very well what I was talking about in my introduction to poetry, about the modern poet needing to know about many things. And a lot of people will think that Pound really goes over the top here. It's certainly not necessary for a poet to know as much as, or to allude to outside things as much as Pound does here. But it's certainly a great poem in the sense that, in spite of all the allusions, I feel that he always knows exactly what he's doing, and the allusions actually always have point, and you can always trace them back. So if you want to do that, you're welcome to do so. It's really daunting just how learned Pound was. I'm going to begin by letting him read part of the poem himself. You might be taken aback by his reading, because to me he kind of sounds Scottish, a sort of old Scottish voice with vibrato, which kind of surprised me. But anyway, this is how he was. It's definitely very over the top style, declamatory. Just say a couple of things. This is written just after the end of World War I, and it predates Eliot's Wasteland. We might wonder just how much it influenced Eliot in the writing of the Wasteland with its modernist, allusive techniques. Certainly, it has this idea that the poet needs to know all about history and art in order to say anything relevant in the modern age, and it's actually even longer than the Wasteland. I would emphasize that Pound knows what he's talking about, and the allusions are relevant, I think, most of the time, and you can always trace them back to a source that seems appropriate. The basic theme here seems to be that Mauberley is Pound. So Pound left America after studying at university and spent a few years in England, and Hugh Selwyn Mauberley seems to be mostly about this time that Pound spent in England, where he was meeting people like Eliot and Yeats, and working with them and developing new ideas about poetry and modernism. But in this poem, he seems to suggest that in the end it all kind of ended in failure, and nobody really appreciated what he was doing, and the only thing left for him to do was to leave, which is what he did. And he went to the continent and finally Italy, where he set up a life for himself, and as we know, came to support Mussolini and fascism in Italy, and was later tried for treason by the Americans. So I think at this point should just let him speak and read his poem a little.
For 3 years, out of key with his time, he strove to resuscitate the dead art of poetry, to maintain the sublime in the old sense. Wrong from the start. No, hardly, but seeing he had been born in a half-savage country, out of date, bent resolutely on wringing lilies from the acorn, capaneus, trout for factitious bait. Eight men gartai panthos and etraye, caught in the unstopped air, giving the rocks small leeway, and the chopped seas held him therefore that year. His true Penelope was Flaubert. He fished by obstinate isles, observed the elegance of Circe's hair rather than the mottos on sundials. Unaffected by the march of events, he passed from men's memory in long tarantunième de sonneage. Case presents no adjunct to the muse's diadem. The age demanded an image of its accelerated grimace, something for the modern stage, not at any rate an Attic grace. Not certainly the obscure reveries of the inward gaze, better mendacities than the classics in paraphrase. The age demanded chiefly a mould and plaster made with no loss of time, a prose kinema, not assuredly alabaster of the sculptor of rhyme. The tea rose, tea gown, etc. supplants the mousseline of Kos. The pianola replaces Sappho's barbitos. Christ follows Dionysus, phallic and ambrosial made way for macerations. Caliban casts out Ariel. All things are a-flowing, sage Heraclitus says, but a tawdry cheapness shall outlast our days. Even the Christian beauty defects after Samothrace. We see Tocaron decreed in the marketplace. Fawn's flesh is not to us, nor the saint's vision. We have the press for wafer, franchise for circumcision. All men in law are equals. Free if persist, let us we choose a knave or an eunuch to rule over us. O bright Apollo, tinandra tinara tinatheon, what god, man, or hero shall I place a tin wreath upon? These fought in any case, and some believing, pro domo in any case, some quick to arm, some for adventure, some from fear of weakness, some from fear of censure, some for love of slaughter in imagination, learning later, some in fear, learning love of slaughter. Died some pro patria, non dulce non et decor. Walked eye deep in hell, believing in old men's lies, then unbelieving. Came home to a lie, home to many deceits, home to old lies of new infamy, usury age-old and age-thick, and liars in public places. Daring as never before, wastage as never before, young blood and high blood, fair cheeks and fine bodies, fortitude as never before, frankness as never before, disillusions as never told in the old days, hysterias, trench confessions, laughter out of dead bellies. There died a myriad, and were the best among them, for an old bitch gone in the teeth, for a botched civilization, charm smiling at the good mouth, quick eyes gone under earth's lid, for too gross of broken statues, for a few thousand battered books. Gladstone was still respected when John Ruskin produced King's Treasuries. Swinburne,
Hi everyone, welcome to Mandarin Made Easy.
Defeated Buchanan lifted up his voice when that fawn's head of hers became a pastime for painters and adulterers. The Burns-Jones cartons have preserved her eyes. Still at the Tate do they teach Cophetua to rhapsodize. Thin like brook water with a vacant gaze, the English Rubaiyat was still born in those days. The thin, clear gaze of the same still darts out fawn-like from the half-ruined face, questing and passive. Poor Jenny's case, bewildered that the world shows no surprise at her last macaro's adulteries. Among the pickled fetuses and bottled bones, engaged in perfecting the catalogue, I found the last sand of the senatorial families of Strasbourg, Monsieur Verog. For 2 hours he talked of Gallifey, Dawson, the Rhymers' Club, told me how Johnson, Lionel, died by falling from a high stool in a pub, which showed no trace of alcohol at the autopsy privately performed, tissue preserved. The pure mind arose toward Newman as the whiskey warmed. Dawson found harlots cheaper than hotels, paid them for uplift, image impartially imbued with raptures for Bacchus, Terpsichore, and the church. So spoke the author of the Dorian mood, Monsieur Verog, out of step with the decade, detached from his contemporaries, neglected by the young because of these reveries. The sky-like limpid eyes, the circular infant's face, the stiffness from spats to collar, never relaxing into grace, the heavy memories of Horeb, Sinai, and the 40 years, showed only when the daylight fell level across the face of Brenbaum, the impeccable. In the cream-gilded cabin of his steam yacht, Mr. Nixon advised me kindly to advance with fewer dangers of delay. Consider carefully the reviewer. I was as poor as you are when I began. I got to, of course, advance on royalties, 50 at first. Mr. Nixon, follow me and take a column, even if I have to work free. Butter reviewers. From 50 to 300 I rose in 18 months. The hardest nut I had to crack was Dr. Dundas. I never mentioned a man without the view of selling my own works. The tip's a good one, and as for literature, it gives no man a sinecure. And no one knows at sight a masterpiece, and give up verse, my boy, there's nothing in it. Likewise, a friend of Blotham's once advised me, don't kick against the pricks, accept opinion. The 90s tried your game and died. There's nothing in it. Beneath the sagging roof, the stylist has taken shelter, unpaid, uncelebrated.
Well, I think that's enough for the time being. It's worth saying that that's not even the end of part one, and yet it's probably the most famous part of the poem, and it's the best known part of the poem, and it's probably the best part of the poem. Later, rest of part one and in part two, the poem becomes even more obscure and perhaps takes a slight change of direction so that Mauberley and Pound are not so clearly the same character anymore. Let's go back a bit and look at what Pound was saying. So at the beginning, it's a great start, I think. For 3 years out of key with his time, he strove to resuscitate the dead art of poetry, to maintain the sublime in inverted commas, the sublime, in the old sense, wrong from the start. So the idea is that this character, Hugh Selwyn Mauberley, or Pound, because I think they're the same, for 3 years tried to change the perceptions of people about poetry and failed, and he was bound to fail because the world has become corrupted and isn't able to appreciate great art anymore, particularly classical art that comes from the Greek or is inspired by the Greek world. The sublime in the old sense, wrong from the start. No, hardly, but seeing he had been born in a half-savage country out of date, bent resolutely on wringing lilies from acorns, Capaneus, trout for factitious bait. So the half-savage country is clearly a reference to Pound's own birthplace, the USA. So what can Pound do to change things? He himself was born in a half-savage country, and now he's come to Europe, and maybe the Europeans don't particularly want to listen to him. He's trying to show them lilies when they only can appreciate acorns. Don't want to go into the obscure references, so I have done myself at different times, and I can assure any reader that if he or she wants to trace the references back, then they will be found appropriate and having substance. So there is a reference to Odysseus in the Odyssey, and caught in the unstopped ear. So he is like Ulysses, strapped to the mast without his ears stopped up, like his men, and he is doing something dangerous, trying to change the point of view of people in Europe, and it's a dangerous thing to do, and he only just missed the rocks, like Odysseus and his men only just escaped disaster from the sirens who enticed men to their deaths by singing beautiful songs, and Odysseus was bold enough to listen to the song and avoid being killed, and Pound is in the same situation. He tried to change the point of view of Europe about art, and he just about got away with his life. So he liked something true and hard and classical in terms of art. He tells us his true Penelope was Flaubert. He's talking about Mauberley, but presumably himself too. Flaubert, the great French novelist, famed for his realism and spending years and years researching his books and writing his books and living his books. That's the kind of art that Mauberley can appreciate. He observed the elegance of Circe's hair, so again, reference to classical times. Circe, the sorceress that kept Odysseus on her island for years before eventually letting him go after Zeus had ordered that. Um, so he observed the elegance of Circe's hair rather than the mottos on sundials, which might be thought to be kind of mundane. So sundials are clocks, old form of clock, and they often had mottos written on them. Nothing very artistic about it. So it's back to the same point. Mauberley wants to, or Pound wants to, convince the modern world about the greatness of classical art, and the modern world is not interested. Yeah, so the age demanded an image of its accelerated grimace, something for the modern stage, not at any rate an Attic grace. Again, Attica, a reference to Athens and the great art of the Greeks. So they wanted something appropriate for the modern stage, certainly not classical art. The age demanded chiefly a mould in plaster made with no loss of time, a prose kinema, not assuredly alabaster or the sculpture of rhyme. So plaster is something cheap that you can make things from, but alabaster is it's far more difficult. It's harder substance and takes time to create something from alabaster. But that's the modern age wants a prose kinema. It seems to be a reference to cinema, more interested in cinema than the sculpture of rhyme. So the modern age is not interested in poetry anymore. It's interested in things which have a brief attention span, like cinema. The sea rose, tea gown, etc. supplant the mousseline of cos. The pianola replaces Sappho's barbitos. So tea rose and tea gown, like cheap material, supplant the muslin, the mousseline of the island of Kos. The island of Kos in Greek island, in the Aegean Sea, used to be famous for muslin in the Roman times. So, but now people are only interested in cheap cloth, and the pianola, the piano that plays itself, replaces the great poetry of Sappho's barbitos. Christ follows Dionysus, phallic and ambrosial, made way for macerations. Caliban casts out Ariel. Here, Pound seems to be saying that Dionysus and his instinctive sense of artistic power, and he was a god of wine, of course, and sexual enjoyment, that somehow that was superior to what came later, Christ, and self-sacrifice on the cross. All things are flowing, sage Heraclitus says, but tawdry cheapness shall reign throughout our days. Great lines, I think. The pre-Socratics, Heraclitus said that everything was flowing. You could never step into the same river twice because the water was always different because of the flow. And so this is what the Greeks said. But anyway, it's ironically he says maybe he was wrong, because there is certainly a sameness about the tawdry cheapness of our times. Even the Christian beauty defects after Samothrace. So it seems to be saying even the Christian beauty, which was not as good as the Greek beauty or the Dionysian beauty, has become less great in the modern age, or less influential. So everything is just getting worse, really, and the modern age cannot appreciate great art anymore. talking about Christianity, we have the press for wafer, franchise for circumcision. Everything is becoming standardized and factory made. So the wafer that's given in the Catholic service, which is meant to be said to be the body of God, is just made with a press. The wafers are made with a press, so it's kind of just factory made. There's nothing individual about it. How could if it was a body of God, it should be something higher and better than just a wafer made from a press. All men are equals, free of Pisistratus. We choose a knave or a eunuch to rule over us. So of course Pound was not very interested, or he was not very did not feel very favourably towards democracy. And Pisistratus was a Greek tyrant, an Athenian tyrant, and Pound says quite openly that if you give men their freedom, all they will do is just choose somebody stupid to rule over them. And then he goes on to talk about the First World War and its influence on society and his interests in art, poetry. They fought in many cases, and some believing pro domo, that they were fighting for their home. They all fought really because of fear, although some did it for adventure, but some from fear of weakness, some from fear of censure, some for love of slaughter. So, yeah, there were different reasons why people fought, but fear was a large factor. Fear of weakness and fear of being called a coward. Some people did it for adventure or just because they liked killing. But anyway, what didn't turn out as they expected walked eye deep in hell, believing in old men's lies. Came home to a lie. Home to many deceits, home to old lies and new infamy, usury age old and age thick, and liars in public places. So one of Pound's recurring themes is that in the modern age, capitalism has really destroyed art. So art now is based on profit and loss and on demands of the marketplace. So the quality of something is decided by how much money someone will pay for it, rather than by its intrinsic quality. So this is something that recurs and recurs and recurs in the poetry of Pound. The belief that the modern capitalist system has undermined the old artistic ways of doing things that created truly great classical art, where there were patrons and perhaps the government supported art, like Pericles in classical Athens, paying for the public building program, or the citizens paying for the public's building program. Now nothing will work. Nothing works unless lots of money will be paid for it. They died a myriad, and of the best among them, for an old bitch gone in the teeth, for a botched civilization. So all these people who died in the First World War died for nothing. So what were they dying for? They were dying for an old bitch gone in the teeth, for a botched civilization. It's nothing like classical Greece, or even Roman times, or even medieval times. In the modern age, with the development of capitalism and usury and interest and loaning money for large amounts of interest, art and its production has been undermined, and great art cannot really be produced anymore in these conditions where everything is evaluated according to monetary value. What did they die for? For 2 gross of broken statues, for a few thousand battered books. So this is Pound's way of saying what the society that they died for was worth. It was nothing really compared to what the past had been, the classical Greek past. The mood changes in the section called Sea Green Eyes. So Gladstone was still respected, the British Prime Minister, the Liberal Prime Minister. Gladstone was still respected when John Ruskin produced King's Treasuries. Swinburne and Rossetti still abused. So Gladstone is kind of typical for Pound of the kind of man who ran this new society based on capitalism and usury, even though Ruskin was showing an alternative in his King's Treasuries, and Swinburne and Rossetti, who Pound liked, were writing, but Gladstone was in control. People like Gladstone were in control. Thin like brook water with a vacant gaze, English Rubaiyat was still born in those days. So again, some fine poetry was being produced, and yet it was ignored because nobody knows or can appreciate great poetry anymore. The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, translated by Edward Fitzgerald, was ignored until Rossetti picked it up and publicized it. So Rossetti was known, and because of him, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam by Fitzgerald became quite famous, but without his help, probably would not have got anywhere. So the same point is being repeated a lot, the comparison of the present time with the ancient past, and how everything has changed. We can no longer produce art in a society like this. Not only can we not produce art, but a man like Hugh Selwyn Mauberley or Pound is kind of a fish out of water in such a society. He is trying to restore the sublime in the old sense, and it's a hopeless task. It can't be done because the conditions of the society have changed so much, and they make the production of great art impossible. Later on, he goes on to talk about Mr. Nixon, who is a successful novelist, and he's kind of giving Hugh Selwyn Mauberley advice in his yacht. So he's extremely successful at what he does, and what he has to say is basically, don't worry about the quality of what you write, just make sure that the reviewers like it, and think about what the modern age require, and give the people what they want, and don't think about if what you produce has any literary quality or not, as long as the only important thing is that it has to make money. So again, there's a repetition of this point about in the modern age, you cannot really create great art anymore because of the need to just make money. Let's look at it. Mr. Nixon. In the cream-gilded cabin of his steam yacht, Mr. Nixon advised me kindly to advance with fewer dangers of delay. Consider carefully the reviewer. So he has a steam yacht. At this time would have been a very expensive thing, so he's extremely successful. He says his advice is consider carefully the reviewer. I was as poor as you are when I began. When I began, I got, of course, advance on royalties, 50 at first, said Mr. Nixon. Follow me and take a column, even if you have to work free. So he began by trying to get the support of the reviewers, and he made sure he got an advance on his books, the books he was going to write. And at first it was 50, and he also advises Mauberley or Pound to write a column in a newspaper because it will get his name out there. Do it even if you have to work free. He continues, butter reviewers, from 50 to 300 I rose in 18 months. The hardest nut I had to crack was Dr. Dundas. I never mentioned the man but with the view of selling my own works. The tip's a good one. As for literature, it gives no man a sinecure. So he says quite openly he never mentioned the man, but with the view of selling my own work. So he's just thinking about selling his novels and making lots of money. The tip's a good one, he says. As for literature, it gives no man a sinecure. So literature is, if you just think about literature and the quality, and you want to write poetry, then you're going to be poor forevermore. It gives no man a sinecure. And no one knows at sight a masterpiece, and give up verse, my boy, there's nothing in it. So his advice is totally material. I assume that this Mr. Nixon is thought of as a great literary writer, but the reality is he's just a hack who's producing his novels to make money, and he's giving the people what they want, and what they want is something of a very banal and low standard. So wherever Mauberley or Pound looks, the situation is very depressing. The modern age is set up in such a way that it can never really appreciate great art or poetry anymore. No one knows at sight a masterpiece. So Pound would disagree with that. He would think that he does know a masterpiece at first sight, as he famously recognized a masterpiece in T.S. Eliot's Wasteland and masterfully edited it. Yes, and then it continues. Don't kick against the pricks. Accept opinion. The 90s tried your game and died. There's nothing in it. That's Mr. Nixon's last advice. So the 90s is the 1890s. Don't kick against the pricks. Don't, from the Bible, of course, don't try to act in a non-conformist way. Just go along with what everybody wants. Accept opinion. The 90s tried to do things in a different way and failed, so you will fail too if you try to kick against the pricks. So I would suggest that this is really a very great poem, and anybody who wants to be bothered reading it will get an awful lot from it. and find that it's very, very consistent, and the images and the references and the allusions all have a point and can be traced back, and after one has done that, one will say, yes, I see the relevance to the poem and to the situation, and one can certainly see the connection between Hugh Selwyn Mauberley and Ezra Pound, and there is the emergence of themes that will obsess Pound for the rest of his life, and especially through the cantos, the way the modern age is set up in such a way that it's almost impossible to create great art, because art now is valued according to price and monetary value rather than by its intrinsic quality. So there is certainly all of that, and there is the very interesting structure of the poem, which is frequently made up of classical quatrains, but then there are long sections which you might call free verse, really, and hardly rhyming at all, and rather similar to the technique in T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. As I said before, one really asks oneself how much this poem, Hugh Selwyn Mauberley, influenced Eliot, because the fragmentary technique, the free verse, combined with classical structures and the elusiveness of the poem, of both poems, would suggest that Eliot did learn a lot from Pound, and it's difficult, but that too reflects the later view of Eliot, that in the modern age, poetry kind of has to be difficult because the age itself is so problematic and obscure that language needs to be dislocated into new meaning, and that inevitably means that the poet has to be elusive and to be fragmentary and refer to things maybe that are usually outside the scope of the poet, or outside the scope of most poets. So I would suggest that this is a very great poem, and we've only looked at a part of part one. Anybody who wants to, or anyone who is inspired to continue and read the rest of the poem and carry through a reading to the end will not be disappointed. So yeah, Hugh Selwyn Mauberley, one of Pound's greatest poems.